All right. So today what we're going to be looking at is what happened after independence. All right, after emancipation rather, all right? So we looked at before some of the responses of the Amerindians. We looked at the entirety of that specifically, and then in our last talk, we actually ended up at the peasantry, right? So what we're going to be looking at is just after the emancipation, right, and the development of the peasantry. Okay, so let's have a look at that. For the persons just joining, right, just join mentimeter.com and use the code to just join the entire Menti so you guys can participate in everything. All right, so you can participate in the polls, etc. Actually, the first thing is a poll, all right? When was emancipation in your country? When was emancipation in your country? So if you have a specific day, sure. But the year is fine. When was the date that they prescribed or that they attached to emancipation in your country? Emancipation. Interesting. Interesting. It's fine, to make the mistakes, no? Remember August 6, 1962 was what? Independence for Jamaica, not emancipation. Emancipation came in, okay, so we're saying 1838. Okay. So August 1st, 1838. Alright. It is better to just use a year, no? It's better just to use the year. Alright, so emancipation is said to fully have come in 1838. It started in a little process in 1833 specifically, but we had the entire apprenticeship system thereabout, right? And then it fully was meted out across the British Caribbean in 1838. The Spanish Caribbean came a little bit later. The French Caribbean formed into different political organizations, etc. Right, for the British Caribbean specifically, 1833 to 1838 was apprenticeship, and then 1830 was full emancipation. All right, everybody's good. So let's have a move on. Okay. So true or lie, emancipation did benefit the people then. Did emancipation benefit the people then? All the persons that existed, well, most majority of the persons that existed within the Caribbean at the time, and we're probably speaking about the Indians, the Chinese, the free blacks, and the mixtures of those. Did emancipation benefit the people? It's not a link per se. It's at the top of every slide. Hopefully you can see it. So it's at the top of every slide. I can copy the link and send it if you want. Okay, let me just send the link in the chat to join so you can participate in the polls. So somebody said to an extent, yes. Why? Well, to an extent. Somebody said to an extent and somebody said yes. All right, so the person who said to an extent, why? Why didn't you say yes?
Oh, sorry. We're always having debates about it. And I just can't weigh my mind to choose one. So it's just whatever for me.
No, you must
So
have a
hence
reason why
the
you
to an
said.
extent.
You must have a reason why you said to an extent, though.
Because I don't know, I just don't have
Well,
a solid yes to
mm,
say, okay, this is why, or a solid no to say this is why.
okay.
So it's to an extent on both ends for me.
So you're saying that yes, it's true that emancipation benefited the people, but after emancipation, they existed in such conditions that were still gruesome. Is that what you're saying? So, to an extent, it did benefit them, but after emancipation, they still went through the harsh racism, etc. Did society change after emancipation drastically? Did it? For the persons who said yes or true specifically, why do you guys say that? Why do you guys pick that position? And these are different things and arguments that you guys would use to develop your argumentative essays and stuff like that. Because if they ask you to state your position on something, what are you going to do? Write to an extent and then can't provide the other paragraphs to explain why? So for the persons who chose yes or true or the affirmative, why did you say that why did you say emancipation benefited the people? Anybody? Anybody that agrees? Go ahead. Nobody wants to attest to why they said it did benefit them? Yet three people came and said it and nobody in here has the will to explain it? So in the chat I'm seeing here, okay, so they had free will now, crazy stuff. So I understand that more freedom. Saying persons have sense of being free and having a power of choice. Okay. So emancipation gave them a sense of freedom or return to them. Well, I mean, by this time, majority of the persons wouldn't have originated from West Africa because slave trade would have ended. So all these persons were majority persons who were born in the Caribbean. So they wouldn't have understood freedom. So I understand. So it gave them a sense of freedom, right? And the power of choice. Okay.
Yes, sir. This is what I'm talking about now. I agree with the freedom and all, but you don't think we take the freedom and I choke myself?
Ooh. You take the freedom and choke yourself. What that mean?
Yeah. As in, like, like with teenagers, when them just get them look of freedom and they go out and they do everything, but they don't realize that they're actually falling in a ditch.
Okay.
Like, in some cases, I see that. And I'm like, okay. So that is why I can't choose an answer. It's like both for me.
Okay, so we're gonna explore what the peasantry was like, and then we'll determine whether or not emancipation was fully positive, fully negative. I think nobody will put fully negative, right? Or was it in between? All right. So, fair responses thus far. So in order to participate, I sent the link in the chat. So if somebody could just resend the link in the chat for the persons who just joined to participate, that would be lovely. All right. So let's have a look now. Emancipation, the process of becoming free from restraint, control, or the power of another. All right, so we're speaking about the fact that the entire plantation system itself started to fall apart after emancipation itself, right? We had the introduction of we have the introduction of the indentureship, well, the indentured workers or the indentured laborers, etc. Right, so we had these things. So the plantation systems didn't really work long after emancipation, right? And for the persons who worked on plantations, majority of them were indentured laborers. And so, what really happened to the persons who didn't go back? What happened to the persons who left, right? So earlier we discussed that they started to form or to create an evolutionary peasantry within the Caribbean. Okay? What is the peasantry? So the peasantry was important in the socio-cultural evolution of the Caribbean. It represents a transition group between plantation and independence. The peasantry becomes a catalyst towards independence. This embodies an aggressive desire for freedom. The treatment of the liberated the enslaved Africans, I should change that because they were not slaves, they were enslaved, was a perpetuation of inhumanity and injustice. So they abandoned, right? So they abandoned the plantation itself, they abandoned everything, right? Africans, even after emancipation, maintained a level of or distrust. So Africans initiated an attitude of distrust for the social institutions of Europe. So what are we saying about the peasantry itself? We're talking about this group, right? It's basically the growth of the middle class. if sociology students would look at that, right? So it's a middle category there. All right, so they're growing in their own specific identity. And since these are the persons who left the plantation system behind, they had really anti Eurocentric views, right? So they developed these types of townships, and they developed these different types of systems, whether it be socially or economically, right? We're going to speak about politically, right? But socially and economically, right, that really form themselves as a true identity, right? In opposition of the European systems that existed within the Caribbean. All right. So the peasantry itself. All right. Let's look at the economics. All right. How did the free blacks cope specifically? Does anybody have any idea? Economically, how did these persons who left the plantation cope? Because no enslavement or no majority of enslavement is over in the British Caribbean, right? So somehow you need to actually make enough money to live. So how did the free blacks actually develop? Well, how did they cope? That's basically it. Anybody trading materials? Okay. Because we know within plantation systems now, within slavery itself, they coped beautifully now. They stole and they resold what they stole. Right? So they stole livestock and those type of things and resold what they stole. They sold sugarcane and resold them. And they did different things that used to exist on the plantation that they carried over into peasantry. So we saw farming, trading of materials. What else? Right? So let's have a look at this. Gaining economic independence. The peasantry has to seek opportunities to achieve economic independence. No, gaining economic independence was not, well, it wasn't easy, and this is why they created these things, right? It was not easy. So after emancipation itself, right, remember there was a rigid social structure within the Caribbean, and social structure always affects economics, right? So there was a rigid social structure within the Caribbean itself, right? So we had the whites, right? Well, specifically the persons who came from specific European nations, right? And then you had the Jews and the Jews and the Middle Eastern people, right? And then after that, you had the Chinese, then the Indians, then the mulattoes, then the blacks, right? So you had that rigid social structure, no social mobility. Sociology students may understand that a little bit better, right? So no upward social mobility at all, right? And they try to keep the economics in such a way as well. So there are millions of blacks leaving the plantation, right? No, the governments or the government's strategies within these different territories, what they try to do is limit the power of the blacks, right, to purchase different things. Right? So they completely disregarded their right to own land, right? So if they were going to buy land, even if they had all the money, they weren't allowed to, right? For specific jobs, they weren't allowed to take specific jobs, right? And this was on the basis of race, right? So on the basis of race and the fact that you are an ex-slave, you weren't allowed to do the basic things that you needed to do to survive. So they had to adapt, they had to cope, right? They had to make their own money in their own way, right? So they entered into entrepreneurial activities such as soul trading and selling their labor for a wage while working for companies. So soul trading activities included a broad spectrum. So bakery, carpentry, fast food businesses, right? Anything that they could do specifically to earn a little money. Many Africans worked as handymen or even worked in the docks, right? So we had those different things. So they basically did the work that the whites and the other privileged groups did not want to do, right? They sold their labor as they recognized that the labor has worth, right? So they didn't want to go back to the plantations as it was associated with oppression specifically. So they tried to do literally everything they could, right? In order to avoid going back to the plantation to work there for money, right? The African women would be sewing, washing laundry, and even partaking in culinary activities, right? So looking at things like street vending, etc., these things started to pop out, right, as a way to make money. All right, so the street vendors that you would normally see, right? So it exists today within major Caribbean territories, right? I think all Caribbean territories. So, for example, in Jamaica, we are very aware of street vendors. They will come out early, set up their stalls, and try to sell something, right? So they try to sell materials, cheap stuff that they would sell at a higher price in order to live, right? So those were some of the things that they used to cope economically, right? So there another thing to it was saving systems, right? So they got the money specifically. They found ways to make a little bit of money, right? And note, this money was not enough to survive. It was not enough, right? But they did what they could. All right, so the saving systems as well is an important part of the economic strategy. Many Africans went to the outskirts of towns and squatted. Remember, I said that policies were enshrined within the Caribbean to keep the ex-enslaves from getting land that could be perfectly purchased, right, by persons of a higher acceptable social status, right, or owned by the government, right. So usually they aim for government land, right? So they set up different types of towns, shanty towns, tenement yards. This is how tenement yards came about, and they squatted on these territories, right? So some examples in Trinidad are there. So all squatting areas that occurred in post-emancipation era, right? So all the different squatting areas, even though it's speaking about those different areas in Trinidad, right? Majority of the places where you can see persons squatting or tenement yards have been built and now solidified as permanent structures. These things have been taking place since the post-emancipation era, right? Because of the end of indentureship, East Indians found large estates in places such as, these two places in Trinidad specifically, right? So there are other places, right? There are other countries. I'm just giving examples that are outside of Jamaica, right? So the East Indians and the Chinese would have found the different. The East Indians actually went for estates, right? So they went for complete generational wealth, right? The Chinese went for some amount of material labor, right, in order to export all their earnings back to the mainland, back to China specifically, right? While the blacks had to do with what they could, right? They could not purchase large estates like the East Indians because they were not of Indian descent. They were not Indians. So they were lower than them, right? And they could not set up the large shops and haberdasheries that you'd see in downtown areas, partially because they are not Chinese. They were below both of them. Therefore, they had to find different means to make out of money, right? And most of them ended up working for East Indians and working for the Chinese, right? So the Africans found ways to pool their resources to form economic institutions, right, such as SUSU, right? So saving and loans, aka partner in Jamaica and box in Guyana and Barbados, right? So most of you guys would have already had a complete understanding of how these saving systems work. This allowed Africans to circumvent European institutions. Remember what we said about the peasantry specifically, right? We were saying that they're completely anti-Eurocentric. So they maintain a level of distrust, right, for European institutions. So they circumvented the banks and different agencies within the Caribbean by creating their own measures of saving systems, right? So that is the susu or the partner or the box or box hand in different territories, right? So this becomes the basis for resistance and rebellion within the Caribbean, right? And we're going to be looking at how that really developed into that so quickly, right? Are there any questions or concerns about this? Anything you guys would like to add? All right. Socially now, all right? How did the peasantry contribute to us socially? Contributed to Caribbean society socially? How? Nobody?
Sir, repeat that. Yes.
How did the peasantry contribute to contribute socially to Caribbean society? So how did the peasantry contribute socially to Caribbean society? So remember we had the plantocracy for how many? For over 400 years. And now we had the creation of this new group. How did they contribute? Nobody knows how the free people contributed? The mixing of races, okay. That's interesting. The mixing of races occurred after emancipation and before emancipation. All right, interesting. Remember what within slavery there were ideologies of white ideologies or white supremacist ideologies that basically led persons to try to erase the blackness from the population. So in any chance they got, they raped African women, right? And they also raped their children and stuff like that, their female children, in order to try to remove the blackness from them. So the mixing of races did happen, especially in Brazil, right? So the mixing of races did happen before, but the mixing of races, well, you're probably speaking about the mixing between the indentured laborers and the freed blacks that started happening a little bit more, and the mixing of the whites and blacks started happening a little bit more. So you have the creation of different things, different admixtures of race, right? So you guys would have known about the Zombos and the Douglas, right, and the mulattoes, etc., 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 right? So race mixing. Anything else? Anything else? It's painfully obvious, by the way. But I don't think we're thinking like that right now. Cultural hybridization, lovely. Right? Cultural hybridization, the creation of new culture, creolization, the creation of Creole culture. Right? Remember what Brathwaite said. We're gonna talk about Brathwaite and his theories when we reach the next topic, alright, which is social institutions. And speaking about the sociological aspects of the Caribbean. So the creation of Creole culture, so the creation of Creole languages, not the creation of the Creole languages, no, but the development and the solidification and the concretization of Creole languages, right? Because now the enslaved persons were not, discouraged complete. Well, they were discouraged by active means, right, to stop speaking Creole language on the plantation, right? But after they created their peasant societies and existed elsewhere from the whites, Creole languages became much more diverse and much more complex. Because Creole languages are so complex. Our native Caribbean languages, our Caribbean languages that existed after emancipation and was concretized after emancipation are complex language systems, right? Some persons don't see them as languages and view them as dialects, but you are wrong completely, and I will not argue. So they are complete languages, right? So the creation of Creole languages. What else? Nobody spoke about dance and dress and food and music, calypso, soca, those different things. It is the peasantry that developed these things, no? Alright? So those things were developed by the peasantry specifically, right? So the creation of syncretic culture, right? So the peasantry's pivotal role in cultural creation and preservation exemplified by the development of Creole language and the invention of the steel pan highlights the resilience and creativity of the Caribbean communities. These cultural expressions not only embody the rich tapestry of Caribbean heritage, but also serves as potent symbols of resistance and rebellion against colonial domination. Alright? So remember, the peasantry were anti-Eurocentric. Right? So now they were free from the plantation system. They were free to practice African culture now. Right? And the East Indians were free to practice Indian culture. And the Chinese were now free to practice Chinese culture. And the Middle Eastern people the Chinese Indians and the Middle Eastern people are all Asians. So let me just say Asians, right, were allowed to practice Asian culture. And we have the creation of syncretic culture. No, one of the main reasons, right? Well, we're gonna talk about that after. right? When we talk about land acquisition and those type of things, one of the main reasons why persons really gravitate to Christianity is because they had to gravitate to Christianity in order to get land and places to live. After they did not have to fulfill the true roles of European Christianity, they started to mix and create kumina and different types of revivalism and different types of Christianity different types of religions, because they are religions, right? They're not types of Christianity, they are religions in and of themselves, right? A lot of things that still Caribbean people do, or Caribbean students do, right, is to diminish the fact that things were created in the Caribbean by our ancestors, right? We're diminishing the fact by calling them pseudo this and dialect that, right, and partial this. It's not partial, pseudo, or dialect. They are religions, right? They are languages, right? And we have the creation of fully fledged music, right? Such as rumba and merengue and mento and reggae and calypso and soca, right? So we have the creation of culture within the Caribbean, and this was by the peasantry. Anything to add? Any questions? Any questions? All right, not seeing any questions. I think I clicked twice. No, give me a moment. So, what was the positive contributions of the peasantry? So them contribute positively. What do you think are things that they will contributed positively? So go to the menti.com, use the code, and let me see some of your ideas on screen. What them contribute positively? What would you say are positive attributes of the peasantry? Economic stability was a thing as well, economic stability. But the thing is, now we were looking at social a while ago. So when I asked the question, if you have anything to add on the economic section, you should have mentioned economic stability. So that was an important thing as well. And you could have mentioned diversification, right? Because remember, before emancipation, it was just cash crops such as tobacco, logwood, like mahogany, indigo, and sugarcane, right? And after emancipation, the peasantry started to grow yam and dasheen and banana and this and that. So we had the diversification of the economy. Lovely to bring that up. So I want you guys to just test some responses, waiting for some responses. Fending for yourself. So an attitude of independence started to brew within the peasantry, right? Learning basic life skills. So remember, these persons would have been born into slavery. Born into the system of slavery, right? So now coming out of it, they would have had to learn these different things. So you say that's positive contributions. Farming and building, okay. So carpentry, masonry, and farming, agriculture, okay. Anybody else? Because I know that is one response now, because I think you can type 3 responses for yourself. Anybody? If you want to unmute, you can unmute, What did they contribute positively? Nobody? So you know that a positive contribution of the peasantry could be the creation of, could be the diversification of the economy that I mentioned. It could be the creation of music and different types of Caribbean culture. So the creation of a distinct Caribbean culture. Could be that, fending for yourself, or building of communities. So the building of community structures, okay. So these different things existed. Nothing else they contributed positively? Come on, guys. I know you're not sleeping on me, You guys have all the answers. You guys have so many things to choose from. There are many positive attributes or contributions of the peasantry. Is it that you're dealing with what is positive? What do we mean by positive? Come on, guys, talk to me. Is that we don't know what would be positive? What would classify as a positive contribution? All right. Tough crowd. Nobody wants to respond. So the creation of culinary culture, right? So Creole cuisine within the Caribbean, okay. So you could say that is a positive contribution, okay. Anybody else? You can unmute, if you're not, if this is not working for you properly, you can unmute. All right, no sir. I'm just going to move on. Yeah, I'm just going
Uh,
to go ahead.
I was gonna say the silence is deafening, but any response that I can think of, it could also be negative in my mind. I don't know if it's just because of how I think. That's why I haven't said
You're
anything.
just a middle grounder, aren't you?
Yeah.
All right.
Decide.
Okay, what are the positives?
Everything I'm looking at here, I don't know if I'm putting it to reality. That's why it can come off as negative. I don't know. I just really actually don't know. Curb is just not for me. And
Listen, Carib is for everybody because we were born here. We're
uh,
born here. We see these every day.
yes, but am I seeing anything positive though?
Okay. So what you gonna do? You gonna press the little mic button, because what you mean no positive about contemporary Caribbean society? Um. So usually the Caribbean is a cultural powerhouse of a region. So usually things in aspect to culture would be positive contributions of the peasantry, right? Next question. What then contribute negatively? So guys, please answer the question, right? So send the link in the chat so you can participate, type whatever you want anonymously. What did they contribute negatively? And if you don't know, just type no in the Google Meets chat. So you don't know. Or you can type say you don't know on the Menti. Alright? So what did they contribute negatively? What were the negative effects of the peasantry? A sense of belittlement. Somebody explain that. It doesn't have to be the person who wrote it, but somebody explain that. Where a sense of belittlement came from? Where did that come from? Guys, you can't write things, and don't know what you're talking about. So the person who write a sense of belittlement, it seems like nobody else understand what we're talking about. So the person who wrote that gonna have to let me know, what you mean. Nobody else writing anything that they think contribute negatively? Just work on your thoughts. What do you think the peasantry contributed negatively to the Caribbean? Go ahead. I think somebody raised their hand. Let me check. I thought somebody raised their hand a while ago. Hmm.
Was a mistake, sorry.
So you couldn't try answer something? Come on, what did the peasantry contribute negatively to the Caribbean? Okay, let me see something. Somebody wrote something in the chat. Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
I don't know if this is correct, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking if they have done a lot of agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
probably like some environmental impact, such as like deforestation,
Mm-hmm.
because probably they have done a lot of slash and burn,
Mm-hmm.
so probably an environmental degradation,
Uh-huh.
probably, don't know.
Okay. Slash and burn. No. Slash and burn came from the indigenous people. Interesting. Right? So we have that. Environmental degradation could be a minor point. But the major points that we're looking at, let me check what happened in the chat before I continue. So so you're saying that the Europeans put a sense of belittlement because they made the black seem a lot smaller than human. I mean, They made the black seem a lot. Well, they made the black seem not human in slavery, and after emancipation, they still made them seem smaller than human. Okay, so the main thing was economic exploitation, right? That we could speak about. The economy in the Caribbean was heavily dependent on agriculture, particularly sugar, banana, and tobacco production, that were largely controlled by wealthy landowners and foreign corporations. Many free Caribbean people found themselves working in harsh conditions on the plantations, right? Often for meager wages and limited opportunities for economic advancement. So overworking of the workers in a poor working conditions for little to no money. Lovely, right? Lovely not speaking about the context, but the point, right? Limited social mobility also existed. Remember that remember, the closer you are to European, the higher you are in social status, right? So even though the Europeans, the white Europeans or the Caucasians and the Jews and etc. were above, the East Indians and the Chinese were above, right? Even within the free blacks, the lighter you are, the more privilege you have. At airports and those type of things, any type of position that included interacting with persons, you had to be at least white, like at least brown or white passing. You'll never see a black person. And you tend to see stuff like that that exists within Caribbean society today. You tend to see things like on university posters, right, and different advertisements and those type of things. You either see the characteristic or the idol or the ideology of the rich black man or the rich black woman, or if they're not rich, they're just lighter in complexion. Right? So we're speaking about limited social mobility, right? So we're speaking about, despite being technically free, social mobility for the majority of Caribbean people were severely restricted. Discriminatory practices such as colorism and racial prejudice persisted, with lighter skinned individuals often enjoying more of the privileges and opportunities than their darker skinned counterparts. Right? So racism was a thing in the Caribbean, and racism is the reason why we have colorism and classism and, believe it or not, sexism within the Caribbean. Right? Because it's within this era we had the anti-feminist movements, right? Or the continuation of anti-feminist movements within the Caribbean. Right? So, yeah, that's basically one of the things as well. Political marginalization, the political landscape in the Caribbean in the very early 1900s. So we're moving on a little bit more, because remember that the emancipation was 1938 fully. All right, so around the early 1900s, now the political landscape, right, was still characterized by colonial rule or neo-colonialism. So local populations were not represented by people who look like them. So they were represented by whites. So they were not represented properly, right? Also, the poor living conditions we could speak about, right? A lot of persons, a lot of blacks had to live in port cities, Portmore, and you have different areas, right? A lot of the poor areas tend to be closer to the sea because of the creation of fishing villages, right? In order to make money, that was another thing that they did economically after emancipation, right? So a lot of the persons had to live within poor living conditions, right? In improvised urban areas, particularly port cities and towns. Inadequate housing was supplied, right? And because of inadequate housing, we led to squatting, right? And that led to the exacerbation of health disparities and vulnerability to disease, right? So you have the cholera epidemic, you have the pneumonia epidemic, right? And all these different things, right? So all of these different things happened within the Caribbean. You have labor struggles as well, right? We're not going to talk about that yet, because we're going to talk about the creation of political unions and socialist parties, right? You have cultural resistance and stuff like that, right? So cultural resistance, right? So we're speaking about negritude, Garveyism, soca, reggae, and these different types of movements. Music is a form of resistance as well. So in speaking about resistance, we're speaking about music as well, right? So the thing is, no, cultural resilience is one of the positives actually, right? So cultural resilience is actually one of the positives, right? So when we're speaking about the formation of different intellectual traditions within the Caribbean to resist, right, cultural imperialism, that would be actually positive, right? And actually, within another positive, right, would have been cultural educational opportunities, right? But not for the women, for the men. So educational opportunities would have been negative and positive. Positive for the patriarchy, negative for all the women, right? Feminist movement started to crop up within the Caribbean and specifically in Trinidad, right, which led the feminist movement across the Caribbean, right? Not Trinidad itself, because males ran Trinidad, but feminist writers out of Trinidad started to lead the feminist movement across the Caribbean, right? And it's actually the feminists who led the Caribbean itself, right, or different Caribbean territories towards free, well, not free, but equal education standards, right? So you can thank the feminists. Go ahead, somebody has a question or somebody wrote something.
Yes, sir. Can gender inequality be one of the negatives?
Gender inequality existed for for hundreds of years before emancipation, but it persisted after. Right? Gender inequality in relation to what? In relation to what? Because that is really, really broad. Really broad. um that is really broad. As it relates to economics and stuff like that, the reason why we have pay disparities between women and men is because of the patriarchal system. So people believe that the men are the breadwinners, therefore the men get paid more than the women. So you have stuff like that. They assume that the men have the family to provide for, so they pay the men more, right? And they assume, or well, in when women usually in these early eras, right, fought against that type of narrative and went to work and went to provide for their families, etc., right? Cutting down their wages was a means to force them to find a man to hold on to marry, and to stay within that family structure. But we're going to talk about that in the social institutions, etc., right? But let's look at this. Culture of resistance and resilience. So this historical feature, right, or the historical feature that originated, right, with the Amerindians in response to European oppression, initiated a legacy of resilience and resistance, right? So this dual response manifested through both active and passive resistance strategies. So active resistance demanded active participation, often involving drastic methods such as suicide, infanticide, homicide, marronage, etc. Right? So these things existed throughout enslavement, right? And some of them actually continued at lower rates, but they continued because within these harsh conditions, if you didn't commit suicide, you would most definitely starve to death first, right? So there are things that were happening within the Caribbean at the time, right? On the other hand, passive resistance encompasses actions that may seem less overt but equally impactful, right? So this includes feigning in illnesses, playing ignorant to subvertive authority or to subvert authority, expressing resistance through music, establishing alternative economic structures like susu, and pooling labor resources, right? So we looked at that before. We looked at the economic contributions, right? And we looked at the social contributions, and those are aspects of cultural resistance and resilience, right? So stuff like that. Playing ignorant and those type of things worked somewhat, right? But they were passive, right? And you also see things like strikes and stuff like that becoming really apparent within the Caribbean. All right. So, question. Before I move on, can everybody just check in for a moment? Right? How do we feel so far? Are there any questions? Are there any concerns? Are there any emotional outbursts? Any issues? How do we feel? Bad? Fine, I guess. Not the fine, I guess. You're supposed to, well, not everybody fine, I guess. But I want everybody to check in because once you check in, I can have this data forever. So it would be lovely to see how we react to this. But yeah. So just wanted to see how we're faring so far. So we had to look at the peasantry, the development of what the peasantry is itself, right? And note that the peasantry was born out of, well, after, right, emancipation itself, and yeah, after emancipation itself, and we looked at the positives and negatives of the peasantry. We basically just talked about peasantry the entire time, right? So, all right, so let's have a look at this now, right? So I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna move on, right? In interest of time. But are there any questions though? All right. Not hearing anything, not seeing anything. So I'll assume and move on. All right. So hold on here. What was I holding on? Let me look at the other slide first. Okay. So let me paint a picture, right? And tell me to slow down, right, if I get too fast. Because I'm going to paint a picture to you. After in the early 1900s, the Caribbean itself was a deplorable place. It was a treacherous place. All right. It's a type of image that you see like dead bodies on the roadside, etc. Right? Many persons were, this was really the period in which squatting really emerged. So you see persons in different shanty houses and stuff like that. Many persons were starving. Starvation was a thing. Starvation was in style, right? Poverty was in style. Suicide was in style. Infanticide was in style. The Caribbean was a deplorable place, all right? And this is because of the restrictive policies that the governments put on the people, right? So we're looking at stuff like that, right? So the people never had enough. The people went to work, right? They were restricted from finding jobs, obviously, all right? And the jobs that they could find, they were really poor working conditions. And even after the really poor working conditions, you never get much money. You never got enough money to eat or to feed yourself, right? So the average mother or the average mother that went out, because men continue to practice the fact that let's have a bunch of kids with this one woman and then let's disappear forever, right? So they practiced that largely within the early 1900s. So women had to go out and find different ways to cope, right? Even after doing that in poor working conditions, they came home with not enough money. So they only had enough money to feed the children. So a lot of women starved themselves and a lot of them died leaving the children to fend for themselves. Right? And even after going through those harsh working conditions, your living conditions weren't good because you were squatting, because the government did not set in place policies that allowed you to actually buy land. No, it's either you succeed to Christianity in the sense where you have to subscribe to the Baptists in order to get land, right? And they did not get land. The Baptists sold the land at a lesser price. So there was no giving away of land, right? Don't think that the whites would just come and give blacks land. Are you crazy? Right? So they sold the land at a lower price, right? So stuff like that. So they were living deplorably. And guess what happened, right, in 1930s? What happened in the 1930s? Not in the Caribbean only, but I don't know if anybody knows what major events happened in the 1920s to the 1930s. I know.
Labor riots.
Repeat?
Labor riots.
Okay, we're not going to talk about labor rights. We're going to talk about labor rights, right? But what happened? It happened within the same course, right? But we had the Great Depression in the United States, right? The Great Depression was what, 1920 something, right? So we had the Great Depression specifically, and we also had the First World War, right? So that limited resources to Caribbean colonies, okay? So the Caribbean colonies that would get enough food and those type of things, not for the free blacks, by the way, for the persons in general that were allowed to get these goods and supplies, right? And some of them would trickle down to the blacks, right? No, these supplies were cut off even more. So all these conditions worsened considerably within the Caribbean, right? And then we had the 1930s riots, right? So within the 1930s riots, within the 1930s, the Caribbean was at a boiling point, right? It's like it was like a pot on a fire waiting to simmer over. History Unit 1 students would know this already, right? Because you guys did this completely, right? So you had different types of riots erupting across the Caribbean in the 1930s, right? Such as in British Guyana, which is now Guyana, right? With Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow, who was the Labour leader at that time, leading the Labour Rebellion of 1939, right? You also have Barbados in 1937, a rebellion led by Clement Payne, right? A Barbadian-born labor leader, right? A political activist. So you guys have heard these names a long time, right? Long before, right? You had the Jamaica, 1938, right? Widespread poverty and racial discrimination, especially hard working condition in the sugar industry, sparked labor movements, right? Including activists such as Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley, right? And Saint William Grant, right? Well, Sir William Grant, right? So we have the creation of political parties out of this, So the Labour, the JLP, and the PNP were formed out of these movements, right? And we're going to talk about the formation of political parties within the Caribbean countries itself. In Trinidad in 1937, we had the labor riot on the oil fields led by Uriah Butler, right? Or Uriah Buzz Butler, right? So you have different types of riots happening. So these riots were so massive and so important, right, that the British Navy was sent in to quell these riots. Destroyers and aircraft carriers were sent into the Lesser Antilles to quell their riots across the Lesser Antilles. Because it's not only in the big countries these riots were happening, in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, in Saint Lucia, in Dominica, all of the Great Antilles, more or less, right, that were not French, all of them were rioting. Right. So this wildfire burnt across the Caribbean, right? So these harsh working conditions led to the creation of labor unions, right? So labor unions, these are basically groups in which people come together to discuss. And I hope you're listening. So they come together to discuss the harsh working conditions and create ultimatums, right, or strategies to go towards, the owners or whatever to actually negotiate, right, conditions, right? So these labor parties were groups within different industries, and these groups often elected a member to lead them. And this was the formation of political parties within the Caribbean. All political parties more or less started from labor unions. All political parties more or less started from the post-emancipation era, right? So it all started because of the 1930s riots. Majority of our political parties nowadays were formed from the 1930s riots, all right, or stemmed out of the 1930s riots. People came together, elected a leader, and they called that their political party, right? They voted for that man to lead them, right? And then two different labor unions would go up against each other to elect one person to lead the country, right? So it's basically that two political parties would, battle it out, right, to decide who would lead the country, right? But we're gonna talk about that, especially within the first steps towards independence. Are there any questions or concerns? Karifta? Um, is that how Karifta? No, 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 no. That is not generally how Karifta was formed. We don't have to talk about how Karifta was formed. We just have to know, say, it did it. We have to know when it was formed. We have to know what it did, and when it was changed or transformed into something else. So is it no? Karifta is an attempt at regional integration, right? But it wasn't as what I would say no important to independence per se. So we don't really talk about Karifta and independence. Is Karifata that? Karifta, right? But yeah. Any questions or concerns? Yes, no, maybe, probably, me no know, I kinda understand. Or what do you say? Hello? Any questions? No? Alright. So, from the British point of view, this was the first Okay, so the British, right? We're talking about the British Caribbean, by the way. So we're specifically focusing on the British Caribbean. Now, after the 1930s riots and everything, and they sent in the Navy and everything to like calm everything down, and they sent in the Moyne Commission, right, and the British West Indian Commission and those type of stuff. Well, not West, yeah, the West Indian Commission and stuff like that to assess the colonies. They're trying to find a way in which we could give them something to transition towards independence, right? So, one of the initial actions taken by the British West Indies was the establishment of a working political framework. This was deemed crucial by the British for the eventual granting of independence, as a stable governance structure was seen as essential. To facilitate this, the British embarked on a process of decolonization, right? And this happened because of the Second World War. Don't think it's just because they felt like figure look of freedom. After the Second World War, the British, oh my gosh, the British were severely, their resources were completely, destroyed. So in the First World War, they lost a lot of troops, etc., a lot of money. And in the Second World War, Hitler they did not make it easy for them. So most of Europe was completely destroyed. Most of these metropoles could not keep their colonies, right? So they had to find a way to transition through decolonization, right? So the British government gradually developed power to local administrations. In the year 1944 stands out as a significant milestone in the journey towards internal self-government. This process was based on the premise that the British would oversee the transition of from colonial status to independent nationhood. However, initially the British were more inclined towards the idea of federation rather than immediate independence. So the West Indies Federation. So what we're talking about in 1944, we're speaking about internal self-government, right? And then we have the federation ideology, and then we had independence, right? So internal self-government started to occur. We're talking about self-enfranchisement. You guys are going to see that term all over Caribbean. So it's self-enfranchisement, the ability to elect your own government. So that became a thing, right, starting in around 1944. All right, and then after we had the federation itself. So the federation was supposed to be an umbrella government institution. This means that it would be a collective system where all British colonies would govern themselves, i.e., all territories would participate in the same laws, language, etc. All right, so that's what it ought to be. That's what they want it to be. So just like the US system, right? So it would be like the United States system, right? Or the Chinese system, right? Or a lot of other systems have states, right? So state system. So each state would govern itself but fall under federalization thing, right? This never worked, right? It didn't work. I don't think it was going to work overall. So, following the collapse of the Federation, a movement towards independence surged amidst the tumultuous aftermath of the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War. Shortages, hunger, and unpaid wages sparked labor riots. So, the labor riots of the 1930s, right? And then the 1940s and 50s witnessed intense anti-colonial action and sentiments. So he's speaking about the growth of Garveyism, the growth of negritude, the growth of different types of ideologies which resist colonial rule. Right? So this led to the formation of pivotal political parties and labor unions. So the emergence of so it's basically the intelligentsia, right? The bourgeoisie, right? The emergence of the bourgeoisie, the black intelligentsia, enabled Caribbean nations to assert themselves internationally and feel academically prepared for independence, right? So we're talking about the growth of the middle class. So the growth of the middle class was pivotal in the movement towards independence, right? A century post-emancipation, right? The newfound confidence empowered black people to spearhead to push for emancipation. Right, so sorry, not emancipation, independence, right? So what we're really looking at is after all these riots, right, and the growth of anti-European sentiment, right, a number of years passed, right, after the push for equal education, etc., within the Caribbean. A number of generations would have gained some amount of education through the Caribbean education systems, right, and now we have a growth of a black intelligentsia, right? So the intellectual blacks, right? The educated blacks, right? So no longer were the people just there sitting having no idea how these institutions work. We have people who studied these institutions, right? Mainly political scientists and sociologists, etc., who studied the effects of enslavement, etc., right? That now understood the need for independence, right? So the growth of the black intelligentsia or the bourgeoisie, right, led to us. Well, they basically spearheaded the push towards independence, right? So the growth of the middle class, as we were talking about, right? So we're just basically this is just reiterating the education in the Caribbean, right? So a significant number of educated Caribbean individuals emerged, fueling the drive for independence amongst a growing anti-colonial sentiment favoring self-governance. Right? However, European nations prioritize wartime expenditures over investments in the Caribbean. Right? So they didn't really care about the Caribbean per se. So they were just looking at the wars that they had to put on, the First World War and the Second World War, right, etc. Right? Various political structures exist across the Caribbean because we talked about the political parties, etc., right, and the different systems that were put in place. We're talking about the adoption of democratic systems, right? So different types of systems were taken in place after self-government, right? Internal self-government, right? Remember that internal self-government is not independence, right? You're still overseen by the colony, but you have the right to elect a premier or somebody to, fight for your rights specifically, right? So they have internal self-government, but they were not independent. All right, go ahead. Somebody wrote something or
Sir,
something?
is it around that time the universal adult suffrage?
Yes. Universal adult suffrage. Did universal adult suffrage come before independence? I mean, technically, it kind of have to come, because people have to vote. So I think it came before independence, right? So universal. You need to also look at when universal adult suffrage emerged within your country. So please look that up and know it. I know that universal adult suffrage came in Jamaica. The first country to gain universal adult suffrage in the Caribbean was Jamaica. Um, yeah, I know that, right? But have a look at your specific Caribbean country, right? The prerequisites for independence. So you must have the creation of political parties. Done. Drafting of a constitution that governs the running of the governmental structure. Now, the constitution itself is an act of British Parliament. So they kind of drafted it for us. Um, so many of our constitutions, as constitutional monarchies, we do have a constitution, right, provided to us by the late Her Majesty the Queen, right? So her government really drafted most of that for us, right? Some persons have some countries created or redrafted their constitutions as they form republics, right? And we know who those nations are. We must have the acquisition of a military. A nation could not depend on the metropolitan country to fight their wars. Alright? So no longer could you depend on the British military, but you had to create your own defense forces and task forces. Alright, so that's where you see different military groups and cadet groups started being, created within the different Caribbean islands, right? Self-efficiency self-efficiency, right, in food production. So that wasn't a major problem because the peasantry actually, focused a lot on food production. Display a positive balance of payments, right? So this is the difference between national income and national expenditure. So we're basically looking at a balance of payments, right? So the country must be able to maintain some amount of income, right? Some amount of positive income, right, to maintain itself independently. And the first governmental structure, which is federation, must fail, right? So all these things must be in place, and federation must have failed before they can give them independence. If federation worked, then we would all have been in one mega state, right, where each Caribbean island would have been a state, right, under a larger country itself, right? So it's something like that. So federation did fail. So let's have a look at this. from 10, right? 1 from 10 leaves not. So I believe the question is there, right? Why did Federation fail? Answer the question. Why did Federation fail? And I'm assuming that we've done this topic years ago, because we'd have started Caribbean studies from September. So why did Federation fail? Just drop in the answers, please. Just giving guys a moment to think about your answers. And so Jamaican country that pulled out. Okay. Anybody else? You guys did not. Everything is being displayed on the screen. Still no, but I'll send the link. The code is on the screen, but I'll send the link. The link is there. So have a go at it. Tell us why the Federation failed. Why did regional integration on this scale fail in the Caribbean? And why Federation failed is a lot of the points why Federation failed actually still is useful for the failure of CARICOM, right? And for the failure of different regional organizations, right? I think we're going to have a discussion about that, whether or not CARICOM is useful. But yeah. So somebody said that they didn't want to share resources, all right? So nobody wanted to type on the Menti, okay? So that's telling me I should resort back to traditional PowerPoints, okay? All right, so let's look at this. Hopefully nobody's typing because we're just gonna move on in the interest of time. So, why it not work? Federation ended on the 31st of May 1962, by the way. So distance and communication, no. Phones did not exist. Telecommunications itself was not widespread. All right, so that was a major issue there. It was not widespread. Okay, so a lot of messages that were sent would have been received weeks later, so they wouldn't have worked per se. All right, so there were no cell phones and there was unreliable landlines, right? Since no collective decision making could be met. Looking at the lack of coordinating development per se, some nations were wealthier and thus more advanced and developed much faster than others. So you couldn't really have the coordination of development because some would naturally develop way faster than others. Alright? We have parochialism and xenophobia. Parochialism speaks to having a feeling of contempt of people of other nationalities. So some Caribbean nationalities dislike other Caribbean nationalities, right? And then you have xenophobia where people have a fear of strangers. So some people are genuinely afraid. Well, not really, kind of have a fear of what letting in these other people into their country would do. And some people just straight up did not see kindly to other Caribbean neighbors. So that wouldn't have worked out well. Personality conflicts as well. There were many strong leaders in the Caribbean at the time. You see, the political scene in the Caribbean in the 1960s, thereabout, in the 1950s, 1960s, you had the persons who made Caribbean politics what it is today. Right? So there were a lot of movers and shakers, strong personalities, right? So each leader has his own nation in the federation. They had to put away their own views and take orders from one man. They were not prepared to do that. Alright? The monetization of economies as well. In order to have a common currency, each nation had to theoretically monetize, else inflation, right, would occur. So in order to prevent inflation, you'd had to convert everything to one central Caribbean currency, right? That was an issue as well. And we had the migration challenges. People from small islands flocked in storms, right, to wealthier islands. Larger nations, due to the lack of opportunities, right? So they flocked to larger nations due to lack of opportunities. Hence, a search for better opportunities were enabled by the Federation, right? Some people came to Trinidad to work in the oil and gas industry. Some people went into Jamaica because there was simply more work to do. Right? Some people went else places because they had more opportunities. Right? And that would actually lead to a huge brain drain on the Lesser Antilles, right? And a large population control issue for the Greater Antilles. All right. So those are the main issues why, well, the main issues for federation. Any questions, concerns? No. Let me check the chat. No. All right. So independence from the top. So independence came from the top. What does that mean? The only country that really took independent well really got independence from the bottom, meaning that persons had to fight and gain independence, like fighting tooth and nail for independence. The only nation that did that was Haiti. The only nation that was successful was Haiti. The only nation that could maintain that was Haiti. Haiti alone. No other Caribbean country could. Right? So no other Caribbean country was successful in any means, not even close to Haiti. Right? So Haiti was the only Caribbean country or Caribbean state, right, that gained independence from complete and utter resistance and resilience. Everybody else got independence because the Queen said, "Hey, you can get it. See it here." The Queen handed it out to you, and you take it. Right? So independence came to all other Caribbean countries from the top. The Queen gave it to them. Right? So we are not nullifying the fact that they had to fight and have labor riots throughout the 1930s and had to go through these deplorable conditions to form labor unions and then political parties. We're not denying all of those things or diminishing any of those things, right? But at the end of the day, independence was given to them, right? So independence came from the top and not the bottom, right? So the Queen, the metropoles gave them their independence, and Haiti was the only one to take their independence, right? So we had that there. So full internal self-government for some of these territories. Trinidad and Tobago got full internal self-government, right, in 1950. Jamaica in 1953, Barbados in 1954, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, and St. Lucia in 1967. St. Vincent and Grenadines in 1969, Grenada in 1967, all right, and Guyana in 1953. I should have grouped them a little bit better, all right? So full internal self-government. And then independence now. Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica got it in the same year, 1962. Barbados, 1966. Antigua and Barbuda, 1981. Dominica, 1978. St. Lucia, 1979. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 1979. Grenada, 1974. Guyana, 1966. All right. So we're just looking at some dates. All right. Those some random Caribbean countries. Some Caribbean countries never got independence. Until this day, they never got it because they remain associated states of Britain, like Montserrat and Anguilla. All right, so and Bermuda. So they're associated states, so they never got independence. Britain just oversees them, like personally. So they're still colonies. All right. Okay. So that was really it. I did a lot of talking. Right, I did a lot of talking. Let me actually go back up. Are there any questions or concerns, guys?